On November 9, 2004, 39-year-old best-selling historian Iris Chang took her own life. She left 3 separate suicide notes, each different from the other, but none of them explaining exactly why she was ending her life. One of the notes included broad accusations against the CIA and other unnamed organizations she claimed were persecuting her for reasons unknown. People who knew her believed these ideas were side effects of the powerful medications she had been taking after a severe episode of depression combined with bipolar disorder. These same people also believed her suicide was caused by the stress of her busy life and probably, most of all, by the subjects of her books, particularly one book, The Rape of Nanking, which was published in 1997. Chang's first book, Thread of the Silken Worm, 1996, was about a Chinese scientist who had been accused of being a communist spy while working on the famous Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb during World War II. This man was eventually deported back to China in the early 1950s, despite most of his American colleagues vouching for his anti-communism. Her third book, The Chinese in America, A Narrative History, 2003, detailed the extreme prejudice faced by both Chinese immigrants and those born in America. At the time of her death, Chang was working on her 4th book, this one about the horrific slaughter of American and Filipino troops during the infamous Bataan Death March in 1942. All of Miss Chang's works explored some of the darkest areas of the human soul. But it was her 2nd book, The Rape of Nanking, that brought her both notoriety and exposure to some of the most nightmarish things that humans can do to each other. Her numerous interviews with survivors of the Nanking atrocity haunted her for years. Before we dive into today's video, we want to take a moment to caution you. What you are about to hear and see may shock you. Therefore, we recommend this video for adults or older teens with adult supervision. We do not say this lightly. We also hope that if you learned something valuable from watching today, please like and subscribe so we can continue bringing you important historical content. Before we continue, we should clarify that today the city of Nanjing is referred to and known throughout the world as Nanjing. However, what happened in the central Chinese city made such an indelible mark on both history and the psyches of many people of the time and since, that it has always been known, at least in the English-speaking world, as the Rape of Nanking, and that is how we'll refer to it as well. From 1603 to 1854, Japan was a closed country. No one could leave the country, and foreigners were limited to a small port near Hiroshima. So when the American naval officer Matthew C. Perry forced Japan to open to trade and diplomacy with the outside world, the country was 200 years behind the rest of the world economically, technologically, and militarily. Over the next 40 to 50 years, however, Japan transformed itself from a feudal society governed by an outdated warrior class to a regional power. In 1896, the Japanese defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War over influence in Korea. Japan also won the island of Taiwan and several other concessions in Chinese cities, which essentially put the Japanese in control of small parts of China. However, Japan was not alone in this. By 1900, China was a weak, corrupt, and divided power, and along with the English, French, Germans, Russians, and Americans, all had areas of China that, if not under their direct control, were heavily influenced by them. In 1904 to 1905, Japan won a stunning victory over the Russian Empire. This war was over influence in Korea, which also burdened Russia. With this victory, Japan gained control of Korea and took over Russian interests in northern China. In the 1920s and 30s, many internal and external factors led to the Japanese military's increased power over its civilian government. Moreover, by the second half of the 1930s, the Japanese military government had established almost total control over the government, the economy, and Japanese society. Added to that was the idea that the Japanese culture and people were superior to all others, especially to China and the Chinese, with which Japan had a love-hate relationship for centuries.
The cells at Alcatraz were small and sparsely furnished, with just a cot, a wash basin, and a toilet. When future Yelp reviewer and notorious inmate Jim Quinlan arrived, he noted his quarters were subpar, with a steel bed, a straw mattress, and a lumpy, dirty pillow. He remarked the toilet had no seat, and the wash basin had only one tap for cold water. Inmates weren't allowed to bring outside items, and Alcatraz didn't have a gift shop. But after the 1950s, prisoners were allowed to buy certain items, including textbooks, correspondence courses, musical instruments, and magazine subscriptions. The first warden of Alcatraz, James A. Johnston, was a tough, no-nonsense figure who imposed a rule of silence from the start until 1937, keeping all inmates silent under his watchful eye. Prisoners could only speak during meals or recreation time. However, Johnston was much more lenient with their smoking habits, allowing inmates up to 3 packs of cigarettes per week, making smoking more common than talking at Alcatraz. To get around the silence rule, prisoners communicated through pipes between cells, like tin can telephones. Eventually, this rule was lifted because it was difficult to enforce and deemed cruel. The golden rule of silence remained for troublesome prisoners in solitary confinement, where former inmate Quinlan described 24-hour silence and darkness during his 19 days in the hole. Prisoners were served 3 meals a day at Alcatraz: breakfast at 6:45 a.m., lunch at 11:40 a.m., and dinner at 4:25 p.m. The food was allegedly the best in the federal prison system. Kitchen staff at Alcatraz took pride in their meals, some even coming from culinary backgrounds. Former inmate Brian Conway recalled in 1938 that the food at Alcatraz was much better than typical prison food, with meals including meat, beans, coffee, bread, celery, chili, tomatoes, and apples, with desserts like apple pie, cake, or jello. Work was the best way for inmates to pass time at the prison. Prisoners not in solitary confinement worked various jobs in the laundry, kitchen, or on the docks, earning 5 to 12 cents an hour. Industry jobs like laundry or woodworking allowed prisoners to reduce their sentences by 2 days a month in the first year, 4 days a month from the second to the 4th year, and 5 days per month after 5 years. Alcatraz prisoners were counted several times a day to ensure accountability. Brian Conway noted the bell rang every 30 minutes, but in reality, counts occurred about 13 times a day. Prisoners lined up outside their cells for roll call in the morning, after breakfast, before work, after work, before lunch, after lunch, before dinner, after dinner, and several times after lights out at 9:30. When Conway checked in at Alcatraz, he was introduced to the snitch box, a metal detector that was used to search prisoners for contraband. It worked too well, alarming on every man coming from the laundry due to the metal clasps on their shoes. A few days later, though, it failed to detect knives being smuggled in the pockets of 2 men. The snitch box was one of 3 metal detectors in the prison, with guests and prisoners alike passing through them, including an embarrassing moment with Al Capone's mother when her corset set off the detectors, forcing her to strip down. Since life at Alcatraz was based on earned privileges, inmates were severely restricted in communicating with the outside world. Prisoners in solitary couldn't receive letters, while well-behaved inmates could send and receive monitored letters, usually from blood relatives. On Mother's Day, prisoners could write to their mothers, but the letters were closely regulated and had to be approved. The handwritten notes were retyped, and a copy was given to the inmate. Visitation was also highly regulated. Inmates had to earn the right to have visitors, with only one 90-minute visit per month from a blood relative or wife. Conversations were monitored, and any mention of other inmates would end the visit. As depicted in the 1979 film Escape from Alcatraz, escaping from the rock was nearly impossible. But that didn't stop 14 escape attempts by 36 prisoners during Alcatraz's existence. Given that only 1,545 men were ever incarcerated there, it's a small sample size. The efforts had to be bold because leaving the island was extremely difficult.
Many times, locals in different areas of the city knew that the best time to try to escape was by judging how drunk the Japanese were, for many of them passed out for a time in the evening, only to wake up the next day and begin again. The uses the Japanese found for their long bayonets defy imagination. We are telling you this because it happened and should not be forgotten. Some of the victims of Japanese bayonets were pregnant women. Some were babies tossed in the air and caught on the weapon. Even more grisly contests were held involving enlisted men, since only officers could carry swords. Another episode of torture involved about 200 men, women, and children and took place inside a school. This torture involved using long needles with handles, not ice picks and not medical needles, somewhere in between, that were inserted into eyes, mouths, navels, and genitals. Chinese civilians were crucified on trees, phone poles, and walls. People had their eyes gouged out and noses cut off before having gasoline poured over them and set on fire. Thousands more were thrown into ditches filled with kerosene and gasoline, and truck drivers also had contests, seeing how many Chinese they could run over at once. Japanese soldiers bound groups of Chinese together along a bridge on the Yi River and pushed them into the river below. It went on and on and on for 6 weeks. Iris Chang was criticized, not for her accounts of the atrocities, many of which were known, especially within China. The Japanese did with great brutality on many occasions throughout the war, everywhere they went. No, the criticism of Miss Chang's book was that she was thought to have overestimated the number of dead, which did not include those tortured or who survived their sexual assault. Chang's estimate ran toward 1 million. Most people believe this is too high, but the consensus is that 100,000 and 250,000 people were killed. The only people who denied the entirety of Chang's book were and are extreme Japanese nationalists who, in their delusion, portray the Japanese as victims of the West and the Chinese. We call the atrocity that occurred at Nanking what we call it because that is precisely what happened. Tens of thousands of Chinese women and girls were raped. Some of the victims were 70 years old and even older. Some were as young as 6 and 7. Pregnant women were assaulted. Many of those who weren't murdered miscarried. Many of the women who survived became pregnant. Many killed themselves rather than give birth to the child of the man who assaulted them. Some of these assaults were carried out by individual soldiers, others by groups of them. Some women and girls were raped repeatedly. Other victims were killed immediately after and even during their assault. So you now know why we warned you at the beginning of this video. Much about the Nanking massacre is hard to believe because it was so absolutely horrific. Fortunately for some of those in Nanking, another hard-to-believe story saved their lives. John Rabe, a German trade official and Nazi Party member, remained in the city to help other Europeans remain safe from the Battle of Nanking and the atrocities afterward. At the time, Germany and Japan were not allies. As a matter of fact, the Germans had sold supplies to the Chinese military for years, but relations between the countries were getting closer in 1937 and would lead to an alliance in 1940. The Japanese did not want to alienate Hitler by violating German property during their invasion. Within a short time, Rabe and his staff were admitting Chinese citizens into his diplomatic safe zone. What's more, they were venturing into the city and issuing diplomatic safe conduct passes to anyone they could find. Rabe is credited with saving thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. After the war, Rabe was arrested by the British as a high Nazi Party member and a possible war criminal. His family fell on hard times even after his release. The people and government of Nanking sent food parcels and other supplies to his family until the Chinese Civil War began in 1949. Rabe's gravestone was moved from Germany to Nanking, where it stands today outside the museum dedicated to telling the story of the rape of Nanking. In a prominent place, another statue stands near the one dedicated to the massacre's victims, that of a young Chinese-American writer who directed the world's attention to a sadly overlooked tragedy, Iris Chang. This video is dedicated to the memory of Iris Chang and the victims of the rape of Nanking. Please like and subscribe so that we may bring you other topics deserving your attention. Also, you can watch The Rape of Nanking, 1998, on Amazon, the story of Iris Chang's history of the event.